Hey folks, welcome to a special episode of the Last Service podcast. I know I said that the episode with Bob Smeitana was going to be the season ender, and it is. But I thought, you know what? We should do another potluck. We haven't done enough of those. They're fun. And today I have a very special guest with me. In fact, it is my wife, Maureen McGee, who in so many ways, is the primary investor in this podcast. So she gets to ask me questions today. Maureen,
yes.
I have a very important podcast question to ask you. This is the potluck. So, what is it? All right, imagine you are walking into the church basement or the fellowship hall or wherever, and it's a church potluck. You brought your dish. I know what you'd bring because I know what we bring. What is it that you're looking forward to the most? What do you long for when you walk into a church potluck?
I think saying long for is overselling this a little bit, but I use the same strategy with the church potluck as I do when I go out to eat in a restaurant. In that, I want to pick something that I am not making at home. I don't go to a restaurant and get spaghetti and meatballs. I make that at home.
This is true.
So I think the first thing I thought of at a church potluck is a really good green bean casserole.
Really?
Because I cannot make that here because I would have a revolt on my hands.
Because you know how I feel about green beans.
It's true.
That's the problem with that. Yeah.
But a good green bean casserole. Like maybe the slivered almonds are getting involved.
Oh. Yeah. Well, no, I'm sorry. I've relegated you to potluck green beans in our life, in our marriage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Okay. For me, it's always going to be some form of pie. No, that's not true. It's actually some form. It's actually some form of macaroni pasta, whether it's macaroni and cheese, like the baked kind,
sure,
a casserole dish, or a macaroni salad if it's summertime.
Okay.
I will sample all of the macaroni.
Yeah, you will.
And then I'll get some pie.
Okay.
So
I have questions.
You do.
So you've done a lot of episodes this season.
Yeah.
How many?
I knew you were going to ask that, and I've lost count.
I don't remember either, and I've listened to all of them.
I think we made it to 24.
Okay.
I think Bob Smeitana was 24.
Okay. So if someone needs a crash course in church closure,
right,
last service, what are, just off the top of your head, the 2 to 3 episodes that is going to give someone a picture of the Last Service podcast?
Well, it's going to have to be more than 2 or 3.
That's fine.
Yeah. So I think the first one that I was most proud of was episode 5 with Rehoboth Presbyterian here in Atlanta. And the reason I love that is because that interview captured the heart of what I was going for. We got past the numbers and the metrics. We told a story from beginning to end. And I think it's maybe very presumptuous, but I think it was therapeutic to tell that story. And I think that's what I hope for the most. I want to spread awareness of the situation in terms of, the numbers of churches closing, the decline, try to gain some understanding about that. I want to spread some technical knowledge. And we've done some good episodes on that of, what are the ins and outs of how to close a church. But at the very heart of it, I think it's a heart problem. It seems to me that it's a heart problem when you have to close a church. It's a spiritual care problem. And I think that episode 5 really leaned into that, but also at the same time ended with hope.
Sure.
Because it ends with the members of that church actually thriving in other congregations. And I think that's really important to share. So that would be one. The next one was a real surprise. I mean, I literally Googled church realty, and it took me to churchrealty.com. And I cold called them because I know one fact about realtors. Realtors will always return your phone call.
Yes, they will.
And within minutes, I had a phone call back from the founder of churchrealty.com who told me, hey, you need to talk to my son. And I went into that conversation thinking, I don't know, this is going to be the like. And it was a phenomenal conversation about the heart of what is happening at a church that's closing, about the nuts and bolts, about the spiritual leadership that's required, about the difficult conversations. And I was just blown away by how much John Muzyka approached his realty business from a pastoral mindset.
Yes.
And John and I have stayed in contact since then. And there's a lot there. And he was able to put me in contact with Bart McDonald, who's doing some really amazing things with funding for churches that are closing. And so I think that's another one. The third one is a bit of a toss-up. I would say, maybe a three-way toss-up, but all right, I'm going to bend the rules a little bit. I'm going to say that in terms of laying the land, giving the 30,000-foot perspective of church decline in America, I think it's a toss-up between Bob Smeitana and Mark Elsdon, who came wide apart in the podcast. Mark Elsdon has done great work, and I think he really understands what's happening with the transaction of land that's coming with the decline of with the decline of churches. Bob Smeitana is a little more statistical, but also gives just a very clear picture of why this is happening in a way that I think I've just come to believe after reading his book and talking with him that, I mean, yeah, there's theological issues, there's pastoral issues, but there's also just demographic issues. The country's changing, the world is changing, and the model of church from the 1960s we've known this for a long time, it's just not working anymore. And that's kind of all this is, So those two, and then I have to throw in there Erika Cole, who's been great, and I had a great time speaking on her podcast as well, but that is just such excellent, clear and concise legal knowledge about how to close a church that I honestly haven't come across anywhere else. So I think I'd be remiss not to say that one. And the last one I'll share is the Good Friday Collaborative. I mean, they've been really fun partners, really good partners this year, referring my podcast to people who had no business knowing about it. I never thought would want to speak on it, but they've been great about just kind of sharing this work, and I'm really grateful to them. But I think that we'll talk about this again in a minute, I think, but the 4 key phrases: I'm sorry, I forgive you, thank you, I love you, in so many ways encapsulate the pastoral care that comes along with ending. And I mean, they're literally the only organization that I've come across that's talking about that in that way. So that was way more than 2 episodes. Really, you should just listen to the whole season. Just listen to the whole thing.
Okay.
Download them all twice, 4 times. Keep listening. Put them on repeat.
I have a question that is not on my list.
Oh, no.
So you can cut this out if you need to.
Okay.
So you just mentioned that you're convinced this is really like a demographic and cultural thing that's happening in the American church. At our small group a couple weeks ago, you weren't there, and I was, and we were talking about you.
Great.
And your podcast. And I said, sort of offhand as I was processing verbally, that I think this is an opportunity for the American church. Do you think that it is an opportunity for the American church, and how?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's not a comfortable opportunity. It's not an easy opportunity. It's not probably the one that we would have chosen if we were giving a multiple choice test on the opportunity, right? Like if you were given options, I don't think this is the one that we would choose, but I think it is an opportunity to shed some baggage that we've known has been there for a long time. Like I just said, this model of church that was really honestly developed in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it's okay if we let go of that. Most of the church in most of history, through most of the world, has not operated the way we've operated over the past 50 years. And that's right. That's okay. There's been a lot of good things that have come out of the past 50 years too. I'm not saying it's all bad, but we have an opportunity to refresh. We have an opportunity to think about church outside of buildings.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have the opportunity to introduce Christ in a much more diversified demographic. And if you think about the way the gospel spreading has been, and if you think about the way the gospel spreading is talked about in the Bible, it begins with diversity. Right? It begins with multiple cultures. It begins with reaching new nations. And we've known that. We've loved that for a long time. It's just sort of coming home. And it may be something that we face here. So leaning back to Mark Elsdon, I asked him point blank, like, something along the lines of, are you worried about the church? And he was like, not one bit. Like, I'm not at all worried about the kingdom of God. Right? As far as buildings being sold, yeah, that's an interesting problem. And we have an opportunity to do some really good things with that. But as far as the Church of Christ surviving, like, for heaven's sakes, we faced much worse things than this in 2,000 years. I mean, give me a break. So
that's a good answer.
Yeah.
All right. In all these episodes, tell me something that surprised you.
I'm surprised anybody is listening to this. And I don't mean that just self-effacing humor. Like, that really was, I did 5 episodes and I told myself, if nobody's listening to this, if it doesn't reach a certain benchmark, I'm not doing it anymore. We hit that very quickly. And then I said, okay, I'm going to make 10 and we'll see where we are. And then after 10, the numbers, people, it became steady and we had a steady listenership. And so, okay, you know what? We're going to go through a year and let's see if I can keep this going. So I'm surprised at that. I'm surprised that people want to keep talking to me about this. So those things definitely surprise me. I'm still surprised by how little talk about pastoral care there is around this issue. That still just kind of blows me away. And I keep thinking I'm going to come across this famous author that I've just not heard of, and that's going to just, make this podcast pointless, and it just doesn't seem to exist. I think I said this on another episode, I worry that the church I grew up in, the American church of the late 20th century, early 21st century, became so ingrained, ensconced, swimming in the language of church growth, that we've forgot the language of pastoral care. And it's still there. You find it in recovery groups. You find it, I think, in a lot of pastors at their best moments. I'd like to think in a lot of pastors when they're doing the job they love the most. But in terms of how we talk about how we do church, the language of pastoral care it's not even secondary. It's just non-existent. But on the flip side, this is a cheesy joke and I haven't worked out the language quite yet, but I think that in some of the conversations I've had, when we think through our personal lives about where the church mattered the most to us, you see this with Bob Smeitana, you see this a couple other episodes, it seems to involve casseroles. Right? It seems to involve that friend bringing you the meal when you need it, because the meal says, I care about you, I love you, you're important. I know you're going through a hard time, but you're not alone. And that's not all the church is about. Church is about salvation and the gospel, and that's important as well. But the meaningful moments that we carry with us seem to be more pastoral. And I worry that we've forgotten how to talk about that in a way that moves us forward.
That's interesting. That's something I'm going to think about. Well, if you were planning a last service, you've heard about a lot of them now. What elements would you include? What would you suggest someone else include?
Jokingly, chocolate and coffee, because that's what I want at my own funeral. Chocolate, coffee, and tell a lot of stupid stories. No, I think seriously, I would definitely plan it probably even around a meal. Just everything's better when we eat together. It's just something about how we're hardwired. Meals are really important. So I think I would plan around a meal. One of the consistent themes is celebrating the past. Not in whitewashing the past, but when you get to the last service, you're ready to just talk about the good things and really put a frame and hang it on the wall around the good moments. That's important to do. So I'd plan around that. There's, I think one of the things I've learned from the podcast is bringing people back, which I know instinctively I'd be like, heck no, I'm not calling them. But it seems to really matter to the churches that I've talked to on the podcast that you brought back this person. The invitation was wide.
Yes.
To do something of a homecoming. Man, I would love to give away as much of the resources as possible. One of the coolest moments Diane Kinniston was talking about, they didn't want the money to go upstream to the denomination, which is a whole thing I won't go into, but they decided, well, we don't have to give it if we give it away. So she even used the words in their last 6 services, they had fun giving the money away. And I would hope for that for any church, that just somehow you can hand it off, pass the torch, so to speak, pass the resources on in a way, like your grandfather used to say, like, I want to see you enjoy it while I'm alive, right? Mm-hmm. Give it to an organization while you're still meeting, so you can see them just be floored and be grateful for it. That's a cool thing. So I would do that. I'd try to identify the songs that were really important. That would be almost impossible for a church that's really old, but just, man, pick all the good ones. Pick all the ones everybody loves. And then, I would go more liturgical. I think even if I was at a non-liturgical church, I would just really insist on, no, we're going to prepare everything in advance, because we don't want this to go off the rails. And then we're going to have time when we can all hang out and talk and still tell stories. But while we're on stage, we're going to include as many people as possible, but we're going to be as prescriptive as possible, because this is the time to write the final notes of this song that was our church. And we're going to do it with a whole lot of intention. Yeah, I think that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Part of the reason you came to have this weird hobby, as you say, part of the reason you became interested in churches closing was that you guided a nonprofit to closure. You guided yourself out of a job, so that was fun. But during that time, which was challenging, would a closing ceremony like a last service have been helpful?
Yeah, man, I wish. I really wish. I remember one of the board members of that nonprofit who was a good man. Just a wise guy, No, that's not the right word. A wise man. And, the sort of person who could tell you you're wrong in a way that made you feel better. And he just said, as we were winding up, like, I know we have to do this, but this is just a sucky way of doing it. And I was like, yeah, it is. Ended in more abrupt. It had to. There, hindsight's 20/20, but there really wasn't another way to wind it down than the way we did for a lot of reasons. But a final moment to gather everybody together, knowing this is the last time, would have been great. Because I would have celebrated the good stuff. I would have thanked a lot of people.
Sure.
I would have asked a lot of forgiveness. And we would have sent people off.
Right.
And that's part of it that was just so hard to explain, that this organization is ending, but the work is actually continuing. And there are employees who are just, their paycheck's just going to get signed by somebody else, but they're
right.
going to keep doing the work. And we should all be really grateful for that, and proud of that. So yeah, the ceremony would have mattered a lot in the narrative. One of our kids just flushed the toilet above us. And that's what you just heard right then. I'm not going to cut that out. We're going to leave that.
We should have told the kids not to use that bathroom.
We're going to leave that. And this is life in our house.
We have 3 children.
And not enough bathrooms. Yeah. Perfect moment, too. That was really just
when you were getting real emotional.
Yeah, I could make that spiritual, right when we're flushing the toilet. We should have had no, never mind. Yeah, I mean, I think some moment to say goodbye was needed, and we didn't get that. A lot of reasons for that. So I don't, it's not like I feel we did anything wrong. It just would have been good to have. I remember the way it ended. This is worth sharing just for example of how not to do it. I was in my office on a Friday, and I was waiting on one last check that had been delivered, shipped by DHL or some delivery service, and it wasn't coming. And I'm waiting there all day long with nothing to do. All the other employees have been let go. I'm stuck there in the office. And the only purpose of that check was to get us over the legal fees and the hurdle, and to make the last bit of payroll. And some kind person had donated that, and it was just miserable. I mean, it was so miserable sitting there waiting, trying to figure out what to do. I'd packed up my entire office. Everything was in boxes. I went out to the warehouse finally when we realized that check wasn't coming. I still don't know what happened to it. They had to rewrite another check. And I went out to the warehouse, grabbed 2 bottles of wine left over from one of our events. It wasn't even good wine. And I locked the door of the office, and I got in the car, and I said, that's it. It's the best I got.
Yeah.
And this sucks. And I hate every bit of this, and I feel like I let everybody down. But I don't, there's nothing else I can do. The next week, the new owners of the building came and got all their stuff, and I was happy it went to them, and it was good. And eventually the building, I believe the building was sold and used for good missions. And, it wasn't perfect. Did the best I could. But again, also that Monday, every employee under us went back to work. And we did the best we could to take care of the employees we had. At least the ones who were the most vulnerable. So anyway, long answer to, yeah, saying goodbye would have been good. Would have been good for everybody.
Yeah. Okay. What's something from these stories you've heard on the podcast, the experts you've talked to, what's something you're taking with you into other areas of life?
Yeah. That's the well, the first one is thank you, I love you, I'm sorry, I forgive you. Mm-hmm. Those 4 statements. I don't know if Diane came up with those herself or if that's something she read elsewhere, but that really has, those are 4 statements I need to say to a lot of people a lot of the time. Wouldn't it be great to live life and not get to the end of your life with those still hanging in the air? Right? What if we said all those before it's the end? So I think that's something. And in just the natural endings of life, we part ways all the time. Sure. We just watched Muppets Christmas Carol. One of my favorite lines is, life is made up of partings, of comings and goings, right? And that's just the way it is. And so those are, make sure that is cleared in the air with people. So I think that's a big one. And I think secondly, just that, this sounds really terrible, but don't over spiritualize things. That's hung with me since the Bob Smeitana conversation of, we think it's, pastoral misconduct. We think it's bad theology. We think it's all these things. And it's really just, we're dying and people are moving out of our neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And God doesn't hate us for that. God's not disappointed in us for that. There was stuff we could do, maybe, but maybe not. And life changes, and it's about being able to adapt to those circumstances and being able to say when, wow, I can't do this, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. It's not a character flaw. It's not a spiritual flaw necessarily. It's just circumstances have changed. Things change. The world's chaotic. It's just what it is. So I think there's that. We should take an account when things aren't going well. We should definitely take an account of our character and our spiritual walk with God. But don't beat yourself up. Not everything is a result of your spiritual practice.
That's really, really true. That is really true. All right, my last question.
Oh boy.
What can lay people like us take from these stories and apply to the faithful endings and the new beginnings in our lives, like you were just talking about?
Okay, so lay people outside of lay people involved in a church closing?
So the stories you're telling mm-hmm. are, they're about churches coming to, hopefully, faithful endings and new beginnings. But as you just were talking about, we get that in our lives all the time. Mm-hmm. So,
okay, how do we apply that?
How do we apply these same ideas to an ending we want to, although you just said don't over spiritualize things, an ending in our life we want to conduct faithfully, and a new beginning we want to go into with hope and joy?
Sure. I think the first thing that comes to mind is self-awareness. I think I'd argue that self-awareness is actually much easier to cultivate for an individual than it is for an organization. That's just been my experience.
Yes.
But the same principle applies. A church gets into a state of denial, and this podcast, it's interesting. I wrestle with the notion, should every church die, or should every church, should I go, is it natural or is it the result of, and I keep coming back to, I don't really know. And that question is for, say, when a church is declining from 250 to 80, where I'm really interested in with this podcast is the decline from 80 to 12.
Right.
Right. When you're really just what causes that state of denial and inaction that leads to gosh, as one person, I think it was Bob and even John, both knew churches that got down to 3 people. Like, how is that even a thing, right? So I think that self-awareness is key. Being able to check yourself, because we can make a lot of excuses for ourselves. Finding outside counsel is the next one. Having people that you check in with and just are able to ask questions to. I tell you this is sort of maybe a meta takeaway from the podcast, but there's one thing I have learned since early in my 20s. If you give people an opportunity to talk about things that they care about, they will tell you everything they know for free. And they'll think you're the most amazing person for asking them. And it just is one of those quirks of life that, I mean, people love to talk about what they love. So you can always ask for help of people who are interested in you or interested in what you're going through. And that helps get us out of those cycles of denial and lack of self-awareness. Having people who can speak into it. I think that's important that we've seen. And then I think I'll say 2 more things. Do the brave work. Cut your losses when you need to cut your losses. Say, crap, I screwed this up and I can't fix it. And I just have to keep moving on the next thing. I'm going to try to do the best that I can from here forward. Being comfortable with failure. Not proud of it. You don't have to be proud of it. But you can get okay with it. And I think that's important. And then I think setting up other people for success in the midst of your failure. So handing off those assets that you have, and if that's just wisdom that you've learned, share it. If it's things that you can do to, out of what you've lost to help somebody else gain, do it. I think that's important. And then grieve. That was the other thing I was going to say. Give yourself permission to grieve the lost. You gotta stay in touch with your feelings. But all of that runs together. If you're denying that there's a problem, you're not going to be okay with failure, and then you're going to pretend like you're not grieving.
And you're not going to ask for any help along
And
the
you're
way.
certainly not going to ask for any help, and you're not going to hand off resources. So don't be that person. On the flip side, be humble enough to say, hey, this isn't going well. This is not what I wanted. I don't know how to fix this. This isn't ending the way I wanted it to end. But I'm going to do my best to make it end well. And I'm going to hand off what I have to somebody who can do better with it. And I'm going to take a minute to be sad about this because, this sucks.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to get back up and we're going to keep moving. I think that's the best we can do, I don't know if that's biblical at all. Doesn't seem not biblical. Can't really chapter and verse any of that.
Matt, don't over spiritualize stuff.
I don't know. Yeah.
I think I would disagree. I think maybe the only way you can make it more biblical is to say that we're gonna cultivate self-awareness by inviting Holy Spirit to
there you go.
make us aware.
Yeah.
We're gonna get the wisdom we need by asking God for it, and we're able to give because God gives to us.
Yeah, I think I should clarify not over spiritualizing. Your spiritual walk with Jesus is, yes, the single most important thing in your life. Like, I'm not arguing that. I think what I'm arguing is that you are also not the singular cause and effect of everything that happens in the world, right?
Right.
There's a sick and twisted sort of egotism to that, right? That like, if I didn't have my quiet time today, then like I didn't pray enough, and so this didn't happen the way that no, that's not always the case, right? Doesn't mean you shouldn't pray more. It just means that you're not responsible for a complicated and chaotic world. And, again, be humble. You're not the cause and effect of everything that bad that happens to people, and you're also not the cause and effect of everything that happens good to people.
That's true.
So, leave that work to God. How do we end? How do we land the plane?
Can I tell you that that's a phrase I don't appreciate?
Really? Why?
Why are we saying that? Why don't we just say, why aren't we more clear? I feel like I hear it at least once a week.
Yeah, it is one of those phrases. Okay, what's a better phrase to say? How do we end?
How do we end? That's what you're making a whole podcast about, Matt.
Well, I think we just accidentally came up with our ending right there.
How do we end?
How do we end? Endings are hard.
Endings are hard.
I'll let Maureen out of this torture. But thank you guys for listening this past year. It's really been incredible. I mean that when I say I really didn't think anybody was going to listen to this, and so I'm grateful for everyone who has. Please drop comments, share the episodes that are important to you. Send me a note if you have a good story that we can tell, or you know somebody who has a good story that needs to be told. We'd love to share those in the coming season. We've got a lot of great content coming your way because we're sticking with this until you all stop listening.